Okay, welcome everyone to the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Today we're going to be talking about a very important legal case that is transpiring between a good friend of ours and a colleague, Dr. Owen Anderson, and his place of employment, Arizona State University. Owen has served as professor of philosophy for many years at ASU. He's an alumnus of the university, and he's recently issued a legal challenge against the university for its mandatory DEI training. Owen's case has recently been taken up by the Goldwater Institute and is currently before the Arizona State Supreme Court. So it's an important issue we wanted to keep track of and try and get the word out about as well. To help out as we unpack this, I've also asked fellow members of the Kirkwood Center, Lenny Esposito, my vice president, and Dr. Darren Guerra, also a member of the Kirkwood Center and professor of political science and constitutional law at Biola University, to join us. In addition, we're going to be joined by Stacey Skankey, who is an attorney with the Goldwater Institute. So why don't we, before we get into the case itself and the background story, Owen, let's go around just brief introductions, everybody. Maybe Darren, we'll start with you, then Lenny, and then Stacey and Owen. So Darren, go ahead.
Yeah, I teach political science at Biola University and teaching constitutional law this semester, and I'm just excited to have this conversation and dig into this case a little bit.
Okay, Lenny.
Okay, yeah, Lenny Esposito, been doing cultural evaluations, online apologetics, theology, and ethics for some 30 years now, and hope to bring clarity to some of the more contentious issues in our society.
Okay, thank you. Stacey?
I'm Stacey Skankey. I'm an attorney with the Goldwater Institute, and I'm also the pro bono litigation director. So I work with attorneys across the nation working on these types of issues.
Okay, excellent. And Owen, let's.
So that brings it to me. I'm Owen Anderson, professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University. And the story starts in 2023 when I receive an email from ASU to all faculty. And the email tells us we'll need to take a required training called Inclusive Communities, which sounds very nice. We want to be inclusive. A state university should include, I'm not being sarcastic, we should include everybody. That's the reason you have state universities. But also in the same email, we're told that it is meant to help advance Arizona State University's DEI-B, the B standing for belonging, goals, and also the national agenda of social justice. So the training was very purposely linked to DEI and even kind of a vague national project. Nothing more was said about it, about social justice. Now, already in my mind, that seems problematic, but I look at the training, and from there it gets even more problematic because the actual content of the training involves, long story short, the Marxist dialectic, the oppressor versus the oppressed. There's entire sections on intersectionality. There's a lecture by Kimberly Crenshaw who developed that whole term. And when you look at their analysis of intersectionality, the purpose of that study is to say all different kinds of people are oppressed by the same thing. And the same thing turns out to be, when you look into it, usually it's white, Christian, male, conservatives. And not only that, though, because there's this other guy they really don't like named Thomas Sowell. And so you realize, okay, it's conservative Christians. That's the problem. And the content of the training bore this out with sections about the problems with whiteness, problems with heteronormativity, and the problems with Christian missionaries during the colonial period. So all of this is very objectionable to me as a Christian, but also just as a philosopher, that ASU is taking such a strong position in required training. So I have a Substack I started, Dr. Owen Anderson, and I use the Substack mostly just to talk about problems and issues of the university. And so I wrote about this, and Goldwater reached out to me and said, well, there's another dimension, which is this actually breaks Arizona law, because Arizona has passed a law against race blame. And this should be common sense. This should just follow from the Civil Rights Act. You can't assign moral blame or worth to a group of people based on skin color. Who would object to that? And yet that's what's going on in the training, and it violates that law in Arizona. And so on that basis, we went to court with ASU, and ASU did something interesting because ASU has a whole team of lawyers on staff. That's what they're paid to do, is this kind of thing. But they hired the firm Perkins Coie, and that's a firm that's in the news a lot because of its connections with Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump last March rescinded its security clearance. So that's a very politically loaded group. This is not the ASU in-house lawyers. And what they did was they didn't say, we believe we should be able to have this training. They said, we don't even think Professor Anderson should be allowed to make his case in court. And we're going to block it. He doesn't have standing. Mm-hmm. And so at the first court, they sided with us that, yes, I do have standing. And so now we can proceed to court. ASU appealed it. And it took a long time. It took 10 months. And the appeals court finally came around and said, we agree with ASU. That was just this last December. And so now we've appealed it to the Arizona Supreme Court. So what's happened is my case has now flipped. I went from that one conservative guy at ASU who objects to DEI to the ASU employee defending all ASU employees, because there very well could be a day, at least especially in the liberal professor's mind, when MAGA takes over ASU and says, you have to take our required training. And they would want the freedom to say, no, I'm not. I'm going to go to court. Well, if I lose, if ASU wins this case, if Perkins Coie successfully keeps this out of court, then all employees at ASU lose. So all of a sudden, I'm Robin Hood, and I'm defending everybody, not just the conservative anti-DEI group.
Okay, so this is fascinating. I mean, it's not unexpected, I guess. We've talked to you several times about all of we've unpacked the philosophy of critical theory and cultural Marxism with you several times on this show. So I think we understand that. It sounds to me then kind of like maybe what the crux of the issue here is. It's almost like a philosophical or political view being imposed upon the faculty, and I don't know if staff, but at least the faculty of Arizona State University. So it's almost like compelling a political vision, right? Is that kind of,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
Exactly.
Is
or philosophical kind of view.
Well, and,
right.
And Stacey can speak to that as well, the legal side, but just from the employment side, specifically need to keep in mind, this is a state institution. So there's a little bit of difference. A private institution might say, you need to sit through my training. Even there's going to be some limits, but that's what Michael Scott made fun of. It's been over 20 years now since his episode on DEI training, where they brought in Mr. Brown and he gave a whole talk and the whole episode's about how this was silly. But apparently someone watched it and thought it was a good idea. That's what we should do. So we've flipped now to where, no, let's implement this kind of stuff. And so if there was, if Dunder Mifflin wants to do that as a private company, they can, but a state institution can't do that. And certainly not the required part. And what's interesting is that part of their argument is, I haven't been harmed. And by harm, they mean I'm still working. I haven't had a decrease in pay. I haven't been overlooked for a promotion. But wait a minute, let's use trauma psychology. My harm is sitting through racism. My harm is the experience of sitting through racism, which, for all you know, I'll be in front of a psychologist for the next 20 years dealing with the trauma of that. So how do they know I haven't experienced any harm? They haven't interviewed me.
And there's the issue, the DEI issue, there's the trauma issue, and then now with the way this firm came back and said, now there's the issue of, can you even sue, right? That's the standing issue. Maybe Stacey could fill us in on how does the standing work? But that, as you pointed out, Owen, that threatens all of the faculty, left, right, or center, because if there's a state law that the university is violating, apparently it seems like this would say you can't even call them to account for violating the law. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes. Yeah. So maybe it might help to make a little step back and just go back to what the law says, right? So the prohibition in Arizona is that a state government or an agency, and a state employer, which would be ASU in this case, cannot require any kind of training, therapy, orientation on any forms of blame or judgment on the basis of race, ethnicity, or sex. And that's a very defined term. And in the statute, they give 7 examples. And we've kind of touched on that a little bit. But essentially, it's, you should feel blame or judgment for your race or ethnicity by the actions of others of your same race. So it is racism, right? And that you cannot change who you are, and you should feel a certain way. You are either morally superior or inferior based on how you were born. So it starts with that. But so it specifically says that the state government can't require public employees to do this training, and they also can't use public money for these trainings. So what we have here is a class of people that this law is intended to protect, right? So these public employees, and again, for this situation, this would be all the faculty and staff at ASU, which again, all faculty and staff are required to do this. Everyone from the most tenured professors to the student workers, everyone has to take this training. And again, every 2 years. So with this class of people that it's intended to protect, in Arizona, we have what's called an implied right of action, meaning even if the law doesn't say, a public university professor may sue for a violation of this, it means we look at the law, we look to see who it is intended to protect, and that person has the ability to sue. And so you have a set of factors that you do in the legal case, and it's called this case Transamerica. It lists out these different factors, how you analyze it and determine if this is in fact the person who can sue and if you have standing to sue. And what the Court of Appeals did, and again, keep in mind the trial court did agree with us, and they did these factors. But the Court of Appeals said, no, we're not even going to look at that test. We're going to deploy a different test for statutory interpretation. We don't see anything here that's ambiguous, so we're not going to further figure out if he can sue. And so that uproots this whole very long precedent that we have in Arizona, allowing people to sue whether or not it explicitly says that you can. So again, to Professor Anderson's point, this affects everyone at ASU. This protects all sorts of types of people from being able to sue. So this really uproots a whole line of precedent and cases by taking away this implied right of action.
I have a couple of questions because this is now being appealed to the state Supreme Court. I know at the national level, the Supreme Court would only take cases usually if there's a conflict between 2 separate appellate courts and things like that. It doesn't seem like this is necessary, that level. It's the next logical step, I'm guessing, that you go to after the appellate court decision. And so there is room to do that in this case. Is that correct?
Yes. So similar to how the U.S. Supreme Court would work, and you could have a circuit split, there is opportunity for that in Arizona. There are 2 intermediate appellate courts, and they could have differing opinions that would give you more likelihood that the Arizona Supreme Court would take it. And here we think that the Arizona Supreme Court is definitely going to look at this seriously and consider taking it. They have that option to choose not to. But we think they will because, again, of this, how this prevents all implied rights of action. It really does affect so much more beyond this case, and they really need to correct that legal error.
Well, also, I mean, we're living in an age now where whistleblower laws are coming into their own, and it strikes me that if what is at stake here is the university violating a law, then Dr. Anderson would be kind of classified as a whistleblower in this instance, right? And do any of those then attach?
Yeah, and so that's something that we could look at in a different light, because that's kind of a different way of going about the legal issue. But at least in this case, this was the appropriate vehicle to do it. Because again, this law, it's fairly new. And this is what it was intended to do, to protect public employees. There was no indication, at the start of this suit that this wouldn't be the case, that we wouldn't have standing. Honestly, this was a creative legal theory.
Could you tell us all about what was Perkins Coie's argument that persuaded the appellate court?
Yeah, well, they basically so they did use the factors. I mentioned this case, Transamerica. So what the Court of Appeals did was something entirely different than either party presented. But what the factors that you go through, one of them is talking about kind of public purpose, which is kind of just legislative intent. It's very amorphous. A lot of legal jurists don't like that because what were they really thinking? The notes in committee, do those really reflect what was actually intended? All of that. As you know, there's so much in the political process, so it's kind of tough to join just on that factor. Now, what Perkins Coie did was they emphasized that, and that we pointed to the legislative record and essentially argued that that's what we're focusing on and that's all we have. But we did brief all of the other factors, including what the actual language is, how it interplays with the other sections and other laws that were passed contemporaneously. And so there's a lot more to these factors to really make that analysis of whether this is the proper party to sue. And they basically just summed it up into legislative intent. And that was persuasive enough for the appellate court to deviate from the longstanding precedent.
But was that because also we had that amicus brief from the state senator and state representative who wrote the law?
Yeah, and that's a good point. So we do have who's supporting us both in the trial and then in these appellate actions. We've had amicus support from the House Speaker and state senators here who passed that law and commenting on it. And so they did speak to the legislative intent and what was behind it. And if anything, that should just bolster that point. But that's not the entire point. There's so much more here to prove that this is the proper party to sue.
So just so I'm tracking, the argument is that they were making is that the legislative intent is cloudy, it's uncertain, or yeah, maybe you can clarify that for me.
Yeah. So they're basically saying you can't just focus on legislative intent.
Oh, okay.
Right. And so they're saying that our argument, they're disregarding all the other points and they're saying, really, that's all smoke and mirrors. They only have this factor.
Got you.
But we do have all the other factors at play. And I mean, just from a linguistic, point of view, going through just the language, it says public employees, public taxpayers, public funds, so these are clearly the people that are intended to be protected by the law and should be able to sue.
What could explain the appellate courts not having, if as a professor, here's what I would have said to that student report. You didn't read the assignment.
Right.
You're getting this back. You got a D. If you want to bring it up to a C+, you got to submit another draft. What could explain the appellate court?
Well, I don't like going too far into my speculations, but from the written word, they seem very persuaded, not even so much by the briefing of the parties, but by a recent Arizona Supreme Court case where they refer to their guidance on statutory interpretation. And two things can be correct. You can have a very clear guidance from the Supreme Court saying how we're going to interpret statutes. And you can also have a different body of law explaining how we interpret them when we are determining implied rights of action. And the intermediate court, they just combined it all and they said, nope, we're going to look at whether it's ambiguous. It's not ambiguous. It doesn't say specifically Owen Anderson can sue, and therefore you can't. And so obviously that would be a legal error that we disagree with, because I think both of those things can stand. We can honor what the Supreme Court has said on its general terms of statutory interpretation, and then how we look at these types of rights.
The upshot, though, would be that any future Owen Andersons, any other state employees that do see, if I'm understanding correctly, do see violations of the law, this would be put in the column of you can't sue to correct the state government from violating the law, right? It would kind of flatten all future employees from calling to account the big state government or the state agency that's violating the law. The little guy is like, nope, you can't. You don't have standing.
That is exactly right. Exactly right. And that's why this needs to be corrected, is because you're saying so many of these laws that are on the books where we've had these implied rights and we've recognized them for years. Now you can't sue and these laws are meaningless. And that just simply cannot be. And I'll point to, in this particular law, there's one section where there's a reporting requirement. And in the briefing and the arguments of the parties, the Perkins Coie law firm really emphasized that they said that that was an appropriate measure of relief. Now, if you look at that language, the reporting requirement is for the Department of Administration. I believe that's the department name. I actually might have messed that up, but it's an administrative department that gets a report of only agencies that have complied with the law. And so there's a whole section of not agencies, but local governments, of state institutions and things that wouldn't be in that report at all. And it's only who's in compliance. And so it's more for a budgetary purpose. And it's not a relief at all. There's no situation in which Professor Anderson could seek redress from that mechanism. It's just completely besides the point. And they tried to emphasize that as that was the relief. It's clearly not. And again, the law is so clear when you read the language and marry it with the precedent that we have in Arizona, which is a very long-standing tradition of allowing these types of cases.
Well, and I think that perhaps, and again, this is me speculating, perhaps partly answers the question, why is ASU so interested in defending this case? Because another curious point is that the training has disappeared. And in other words, ASU isn't sending out 2-year reminders anymore to take this training. So I'm suspecting that Perkins Coie costs quite a bit per hour. Why is a state institution spending that money? Well, it's got to be this bigger point, not because the current point, it can't be that. It's got to be the bigger point of saying this is protecting us going forward in the future. And I think that would be a really interesting Freedom of Information Act once it's all done. How much did ASU spend on Perkins Coie? And then just put that number in front of the Arizona people and say, hey, just so you know, they spent this amount of money in addition to the lawyers they already pay at ASU. I want to know that as a state, not only as a professor, but as a state taxpayer.
I'm curious, has Perkins Coie have a history of these types of litigation tactics? Have you seen this in other states? Have they been successful in other states? I realize that the law from state to state is varied, but a lot of times law firms will kind of pull the same rabbits out of their hats. So I'm kind of curious as to what their track record has been prior to this.
I won't say that I've seen a consistent pattern that would make sense here. I will say they are a very good law firm. So regardless of maybe political affiliations or things that they've been associated with, these are really good lawyers. So this isn't again like a cheap parlor trick. They have thought very hard and deeply about the law, and they had a plausible enough argument to make this, and so that's what they went forward with. Now, obviously, we think it's very wrong, and it's an error, but they're zealously defending their clients as they should, and they are good lawyers to have thought it through. However, I'm not a huge fan of the kind of timeline that this is all taken, because Professor Anderson's still sitting there not knowing if eventually he will be disciplined or not for not doing this training. Which is a really, really difficult position to be in. And so this kind of the appellate process that we've gone on, it's peculiar and it's taking a lot of time. And I wish that we would be able to continue in court as we should have been able to and expedite some relief.
Oh, yeah, that's always, as an employee, that's always hanging over me. Even if the training disappeared in the future, there's a past mark against me, which could be pursued in addition to the trauma of going through a racist training, which we wouldn't ask people to do in any circumstances. So those things are still there kind of hanging over us while the appeals court took so long.
Are there others who have refused to do the training?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, the people that reached out to me, I know some people who reached out to me, and I guess I don't want to speak for anyone else, but if I was to give like a number of people who have told me thank you for doing this versus people who sneer among professors, and this is not a sociologically approved blind study, it's an anecdotal study, but it's like 99 on the pro DEI side percent to 1%. And that's consistent with a college fix study from last November, which I believe they studied 2,000. This is a little more scientific than my anecdote. And they studied 2,000 professors. They asked them a question, and of those, 97% self-identified as left or far left. And that doesn't mean the other remaining 3% are conservatives. They might be a libertarian who also leans to the left. And so, in other words, that's a whole nother issue. Something's gone badly wrong at our state university if it doesn't live up to its own standard, which is to be inclusive. And that's some of the least inclusive numbers I've ever seen.
So right now you have the initial step in the legal battle is to reestablish the precedent that one can sue in cases like this, right? And then there would be the follow-up to that, which is then the actual content of the DEI training and why it is why it goes against Arizona state law, right? And that's that. What's the law again that would be that it would be up against? I know it was stated in one of the What's that law called?
The statute. The statute. It's the blame or judgment statute is kind of the shorthand that we've given it. It's ARS 41-1494. So we would then, if we prevail at the Arizona Supreme Court, we go back to trial. That's kind of where the next step would be. And we'd proceed in a normal path of litigation. There could be discovery. We can ask, the different forms of this training, how many iterations it's gone through. We can seek all those emails of requiring, the types that Professor Anderson got saying you have to do this. But we can also inquire and see if there was any discipline that happened from this. So we can do all of that in the discovery phase. And then ultimately we would go to trial or other dispositive motions on this case to figure out if this training did in fact violate the blame or judgment statute.
Well,
okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious, and when that phase, when we go into that phase, because I think we understand that the law or the statute talks about, what was it, race? What does it mention? Race, gender,
race, ethnicity, or sex.
Race, ethnicity, sex. But then we also know that white or whiteness, in the context of these sort of critical, these DEI trainings that are born out of critical theory, really is a stand-in for a set of ideas and beliefs, right? And sort of that then get connected to the racial term white is used, but it's really, more like code language for what Owen said, conservative kind of beliefs. Ideas.
So I would correct that a little bit, because I would say in our circles, that's true. We would say whiteness means a certain set of values or beliefs that people hold, which is why Clarence Thomas is in there also.
Right.
But on their side, they really do mean skin color, and that there's a certain skin color and there's gradations of skin color with like absolute whiteness on one side and not whiteness and in between, which is why you can do falsification arguments, because Clarence Thomas doesn't fit close to the side they're talking about, and yet he would be one of their greatest targets. And so that's part of the problem with their argument, is they really do keep it just at a skin level. That's where it starts. And from there it goes, because you have the skin color, you're probably conservative, Christian, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas we would do the opposite and say, we starting with beliefs, and lots of different skin colors show up underneath these same beliefs.
Right. Okay. So they are more, not as explicitly tying it, almost deterministically to
Well, that's the problem.
the
Marxism
classical
always ends
construct of race as ethnic, or even color, right?
Well, yeah, Marxism always ends up with determinism, and I always point out when I say Marxism, I'm not like a professor who's talking about fascism. Everyone who voted for Trump's a fascist, because the people we're talking about in most cases self-identify as a Marxist. That's not, to them, they don't consider that an insult. And for the 2 or 3 who say, no, this is not the 1950s, I'm not a Marxist. Well, you just follow up with, well, how do you understand history? And they'll say, well, I believe history is divided into the oppressors and the oppressed. And you say, okay, that's the Communist Manifesto, right? You are a Marxist, you just didn't know it. So on the other hand, when a liberal says you're a fascist, the person they're talking to would say, no, I'm not. I'm actually a small government conservative, which is the opposite of a fascist. And fascism and Marxism are both socialist views on the left, arguing about if it should be international socialism or national socialism, and the small government conservatives over here. And so it's important for our audience to know that there really is Marxism. It's quite popular among professors. Most of them would be okay even saying, yeah, I am that. I believe in this dialectic. And then the CRT movement, nuances it a little bit by saying it's not just economic, it has to do with your race. And I actually had an interesting Twitter exchange with a professor who was saying, kind of what you're saying, whiteness doesn't mean that. Whiteness just means these values. And I asked him a question which I think you would have survived. You would have given the correct answer. But I asked him, and how do you notice who holds those beliefs? Now, you'd probably say, well, you ask people and you get to know them as individuals. But he said, well, by their skin color. So, and which skin color is that? Well, it's the white one.
Okay. So that's interesting. So his response was, it is a stand-in for a set of beliefs, but the beliefs are determined. He almost then admitted that he believes that the beliefs are determined by the skin color.
Successfully categorized. Like it's such a successful thing to scan a room and see who has what color and then say they must believe this, that it's not even worth criticizing. It's such a good method. But part of what comes up with that is the concern about the skin color is a concern about oppression. That's where what Stacey pointed out, the law gets into blame. So what you're saying is a couple things. There's a couple things that come up now in the training, which are also problematic. You can decide who's been an oppressor based on their skin color. Mm-hmm. And if you get to know them and it turns out they were nowhere near slavery. Their ancestors grew up in far north Sweden until 1998 and then moved to Arizona and had zero benefit. They just ate reindeer all the time. They had zero benefit from any slavery of any kind. Well, but you since then have been complicit unconsciously. And so this is where Freud comes in because you're guilty if you do say something racist, but you're also guilty if you don't.
Yeah, it's a therapist's dilemma.
Because of your skin color. And what skin color is that? Well, white skin color. So there you've broken the law again. And that's where there's a whole component, a whole module about the problem of white supremacy in this training. Now, all of us on this call are against white supremacy. My denomination, the Reformed Presbyterians, just 2 weeks ago, issued a statement against kinism, which is a conservative. Now, the kinists would say, we're not white supremacists. That's part of the argument. But it's broader than that. We issued a statement against that. And so all of us would say we're against it. But according to the kind of training in ASU's module, there's a good chance that at least some of us on this call are white supremacists unconsciously because we've been promoting this system.
Right.
Well, how do you know who's been doing that? By their skin color.
Yeah, and that would butt up then against the statute. Okay, because I was saying like there could be. It's more of an intellectual strategy to back off and say, well, we really don't mean white in his skin color, but it still would be a political view that is being imposed upon faculty and staff. Political philosophy that you have to accept. That would be like me saying, you have to take a training, and if you don't accept the existence of universals, you're going to be disciplined or something. When that's just there's no correct answer on something like that. But then in the training, I read one of the quotes was that there are right and wrong answers on what are ultimately philosophical questions, and one can either pass or fail. And if you fail to give the correct answers right, then you're looking at disciplinary action.
Well,
right?
and this has been my position with my colleagues about this issue and other ones that come up, because they make us, in my college, they make us sit through a Native American land acknowledgement. And that's a movement that exists within the larger Marxist decolonizing project. So it's not just a movement that says, hey, we affirm Native American students. Of course we do. That was never at question. We affirm lots of kinds of students. We don't read any other land readings. It was a movement to do what Billie Eilish gave into. It's a movement to get people to say, oh, this is stolen land. Well, then whose land is it? Well, now the Marxists just achieved their goal. So I've had this conversation with my colleagues, and I've said, you can believe that. The current debate is not if you can believe that or not. The current debate is, are ACD laws 205-1 that govern Arizona State University say we can't use ASU property, meetings, buildings, time, emails, anything to promote personal political agendas. And this is a personal political agenda. And so that's why it should stop. So in other words, there's two debates to have. One is DEI or land acknowledgements or decolonizing, are those false? And those of us here might be able to say, yeah, we think they are. But that's really not even what's going on here. The issue is, should a university take a position and then require everyone to learn that position? Right. And I think even a liberal would be able to say, no, I don't want that, because what if one day it's Christianity? University should be where everyone goes and debates about everything.
Yeah, that's right.
And that gets to the core, the core political issue. This is a publicly funded university. Every citizen in Arizona is taxed to fund this university, and those citizens have all range of political views, all range of ethnic backgrounds, and so the public money is flowing in, and then the public money comes in, and then they kind of act as this private cabal, like, we're going to institute our view of politics, our view of race, our view of these things, and when someone objects, like yourself, that's where the second lawsuit really gets. It's like they want to insulate the government from being held accountable. They don't want to insulate it from the money, but they want to insulate it from accountability for how they use that money, and that's hard to take.
Well, and that's where I think there's some daylight that, and as we pivot to, this is now an employment case.
Yeah,
I'm now Noam Chomsky.
Yeah,
I'm now the old-fashioned hippie liberal professor who's against big government and big corporations. So that should be every professor at ASU should be rallying behind me.
Yeah. No, because I want people to understand that at the end of the day, this is really about ideological dominance of our academic institutions, which, we've had Corey Miller, we've had you and Corey on at the same time. We've talked about this before. I mean, when we know the history of this is why the culture's in the place it's at, is because the institutions have been so dominated by one ideology, at least since the 1960s. And it's the same ideology here, right? That has dominated the East Coast and all the coastal universities, that seeped in through the sociology departments and everything else that is critical theory. So it's still, it's that battle that's being, that you're fighting here. And so.
Well, one quick thing is, I've been reading the Epstein files. I did a little search. You can go to DOJ.gov.
That's an interesting place to go. All right.
Well, because I just said, I'm the Noam Chomsky. And the only reason I want to say that in general is because in the Epstein files, Lawrence Krauss, an ASU professor, was getting Jeffrey Epstein's help to hire Noam Chomsky at ASU. Noam Chomsky was asking for the help of Jeffrey Epstein. So you can go to DOJ, you can put in Arizona State University, and lots of fun stuff comes up.
Yeah.
I want to ask Owen, I know that we had talked previously, and you had said that the DEIB curriculum originates at ASU. I'm assuming that they have a department, a diversity department. Who is in charge of kind of amassing all of this?
Yeah. I don't have like a name off the top of my head. Yeah.
No, I'm just wondering, is this an existential threat? For example, what was it? The Washington Post, they laid off all these reporters, and their diversity reporting department went down from 100 reporters to 30. Mm-hmm. So, for example, and people were decrying this as, oh my gosh, there's only 30 diversity reporters. How in the world are we ever going to get the message out? I'm going, you had 100 of people reporting only on the diversity issue. Mm-hmm. that tends to tip the hand of the organization to say that there's. So I'm wondering if there is if the diversity department or whatever department in ASU, I'm wondering if who's generating this stuff. And B, if there's an existential threat, is because if you go through 4 years of undergrad, 2 years of master's degree in order to get a ethnic studies degree, the only places that you're going to be hired these days are places like universities. So if the universities have to pull the plug on the DEI, you're going to be looking for a job where there's not a whole lot of jobs to be had. I'm just wondering if there is just an existential threat that some of these folks may be feeling.
Yeah, I think there is in terms of your first question, there is a department or a name on the email I started off my story with, and off the top of my head is escaping me, but I do know it's when I've gone to this training is underneath the provost's office, but that's just because that's what the provost does. The provost is in charge of all academic stuff at the university, but there's a particular kind of like inclusive communities is underneath some project ASU had, which has a name, and it'd be easy enough to find that when I look back at my notes. So that's a good question. Like, who's in charge of that? How much money does it take, state money? Because I think that we've seen studies like this from various groups like the College Fix, looking at how much money universities spend. In this case, it's not private money, it's state tax money compared to, things for students. Now, one of the positive arguments for it would be, well, this is HR. We've got a lot of people here. We have 190,000 students, and then we got, 50,000 employees, professors, et cetera. So we've got to train them about what to do if they have conflicts, how to get along, et cetera. Just like we have fire training, we have computer safety training. And that's kind of how it's presented. And that intuitively you can see the point. Mm-hmm. How does HR work? What if I'm upset at my colleague? What do I do? But that's why we have the screenshots of the actual training. This is not that at all. This, in fact, could be giving very dangerous advice in the sense that if there's a conflict, you assess people's skin color, decide who's at blame. Well, that's not going to go well either within the institution or legally.
Just to add on to that, we did do public records requests to get some more information on where this started, the different versions of tests that they had, which we do know they've stopped doing a quiz after the training. But there were quizzes and tests on this.
And tell them why that's important.
Well, there would be compelled speech because you're having to agree to what is a correct answer after taking these trainings.
Right.
But we did also figure out on the money. We've asked about the money, and we've had our own battles just on public records fronts with ASU. We did get a little bit of information, and so I know some of this was a collaboration with Starbucks. And Starbucks having their DEI program and kind of doing that alongside of ASU. But everything we have is kind of vague. So all of this would need to be flushed out through discovery in that phase of litigation. But it does look like there is continued growth in this area. There's a lot of, again, kind of vague statements of that this is continuing. This is an ever-going project that they continue to work on and update, which is why, again, you have to take this every 2 years, is because they're always adding to it and doing more things with it. So I don't know exactly who is, the focal point or group that is behind this, but I do know that there is clearly a lot of money and effort behind it.
And the Starbucks connection is important because ASU offers Starbucks employees free tuition for our online 4-year degree. And so I can imagine that Starbucks as a massive corporation also has internal HR, and there was some kind of overlap with them wanting to have that with ASU. And that reminds me now that I did some of the videos I watched were by Starbucks and clearly for Starbucks employees, but that still raises the problem of ASU could, I don't want to give out free chess advice. This is not legal advice because I'm not a lawyer. I'm only a philosopher, but it's chess advice. What they should have said 2 years ago was, oh, wow, Professor Anderson, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We worked with another outside company, and clearly we didn't catch a couple things that they put in there. We don't approve of that either. We're gonna make our own in-house training to more correctly represent ASU's ideals. That would be it. It's all done. No lawyers, no fees, nothing. Instead, the first thing they did was they said it doesn't even exist. DEI training? What are you talking about? Where's that? and they go in the news with that kind of story. So it's just a strange sort of, I think there's larger things that must be being protected here. And if Starbucks involved, Starbucks might say, hey, why are you throwing us under the bus? But one of the stories from the Starbucks training, which was always stood on my mind, was in this video, a Starbucks employee saying how hurtful it is. She moved to the country, and she has a name that Americans can't pronounce, and they always get it wrong. You know how Starbucks writes your name down and calls your name? They always get it wrong, and for her, it's like an existential crisis. This is the worst thing that has happened to her in her existence. Here's the thing. I go to Starbucks, not a lot, but I do go there. They never get my name right, and my name only has 4 letters. I've been called Odin, which I guess that's a compliment. Me, when they call out Odin, oh, hey, that's actually me. I'm
one of the Avengers.
But it's never been an existential crisis. I just kind of laugh. If I think about it all, I laugh about it and move on. So what stands out to me in these trainings is they almost tell you what to be offended about. Like, oh, you're not offended by someone saying Olin instead of Owen? Yeah. No, you should be. Well, not you, Owen, because look at you, but someone else should be.
Well, for the last about 20 years ago, almost everybody started calling me Castillo. I started noticing it in the Army. I was no longer Sergeant Costello. I was Sergeant Castillo, and it's still to this day. And I'm like, it doesn't offend me, but it's like, it's fairly obvious there's not an A and an I in my name. Just real quick, a technical point on the training. Now, it was, not only was it mandatory, but there was this quiz at the end with right and wrong answers. And then if you failed the quiz, obviously you would have to retake it, right? Now, I'm assuming that maybe would there still be a legal challenge if there was no quiz? It was mandatory just to read through it. Yes. Is there a legal challenge there still, or could ASU back off and that take care of the problem?
So when we initially filed our complaint, we had 2 counts. One was for the state violation for the blame or judgment statute. And then the other was under our state constitution for free speech, that this was compelled speech to have this test. And they had removed that test after our filing. And so we amended our complaint. We withdrew that. But we still have this state law challenge because, again, it's still required training and it's using public funds to do it.
Okay.
And I actually had just on my desk a printout of some of the training. I should have mentioned this sooner, but let me just read it. It's really quick. It's really short. Let me read it to you. This is a video transcript from the training. And this person says there's a time period between 1500s and 1800s that encompasses both Spanish colonization and Euro-American colonization. And what colonization did, and was it really created this system of binary thinking. There were folks that were inherently good, and there were folks that were inherently bad. So that's the problem, is binary thinking. Now, who does the binary thinking? Well, the whiteness people. And the other people, the other binary doesn't do it. So it's this kind of, it both breaks the law and is logically absurd.
I mean, there's something very just unscholarly about that as well, which is like, this is a university. This is where you're training minds to think critically and in nuanced fashion about things like history. And then you have a statement like that in a mandatory training.
Well, and they always use the Mott and Bailey fallacy. And I was on with KJGZ, which is NPR affiliate. So, they're going to be a little bit on the left. But the reporter asked me good questions because they're the kind of questions my colleagues would ask me. So I was glad to answer them. But what happens is there's always a presentation up front of, hey, we need to know our students. Some of our students come from very difficult backgrounds, and they're going to have a harder time understanding the information than a student who didn't have that difficult background. Every teacher on earth, including me, would say, yes, I've been doing that for 26 years. Of course, I want every one of my students to do well. And that's one of the problems with grade inflation debates. Because if I am a good teacher, all of my students will get an A. And so to tell me ahead of time, like, no, you got to have some that get B's and C's. Well, not if I'm successful. I'm trying to help this guy who I know had that hard time do really well in class. And he did end up doing really well because of that. But that's what they fall back to when, I guess I got the image wrong. That's the one they fall back to when you attack the first stage of DEI. Mm-hmm. So you'll go out and you'll say, well, DEI has these racial problems. So you're saying teachers shouldn't know the problems that students face.
Yeah.
What? Well, it's a non sequitur. It kind of takes you off guard from it because you're like, well, no, of course they should do that. Okay, well, that's what the training is about. No, it's not. It's about whiteness.
It's about that much
There-
more.
Well, you got to learn about that if you're going to help students.
There was a really interesting clip where they were interviewing Harvard students, and these 4 girls were together, and 3 of them were, typical waspy, blonde-haired New Englanders. They're all actually from the New England, but the 4th one was Hispanic, and the 3 turned to the 4th one, and they're like, "Well, what is it like to have relatives who are maid?" And she looks back at him. My parents were a doctor and a professor. I'm at Harvard. Why do you think and assume that I come from a background of manual labor and I was just a DEI student entry? And this is the kind of thing that is fomented because of the assumptions that are made.
Yeah. So I think if for a state university, and I'm sure Biola as well, any university would say, this is one reason we don't just do industrialized education. And people might kind of laugh if I say ASU, because it would say, well, that's the poster child for industrialized education. But we want professors in classes with a reasonable number of students so they can get to know their students and get to know what challenges they face and help them in their education process. And when we turn it just into impersonal online students with 10,000 in every class, you don't get that. But the idea that this training would help with that, I would make the case it actually aggravates the problem with this content. Yeah. This content doesn't help anybody. And that's always what happens with Marxism. Marxism's only motivating emotion is anger and coveting. Your problems in life are due to your neighbor.
Yeah.
And if you just get your stuff back from them, you'll have a much better life. There's no motivation of love in the Christian sense of the term, and therefore no real self-sacrifice, even though the Marxists will call on its people to self-sacrifice. It's more just like as cogs in a machine, but not in a Christian sense. And so what do you, just from an HR perspective, what do you think is going to happen when you teach your employees to hate each other?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Well, and that's what the individual always gets lost up in the Marxist system. It's all about the great machine of history rolling forward, and whatever happens between individuals, oh well. I mean, that's too bad. And so it is all this stuff. We can't touch on it here, but it is at the spiritual level, it's devastating. It just devastates all our interpersonal relationships and our friendships.
So, Stacey, I do have one other question. Obviously, we want this to proceed at a state level, but regardless of that, it also strikes me that there are federal concerns here as well. I mean, the Civil Rights Act of 1965 still exists, and DEI training seems to be on its face violating the federal Civil Rights Act. Would there be federal actions that can be pursued given the circumstances here?
Yeah, and that's definitely something that could be pursued. And I know, just to kind of speak to it briefly, I mean, there's a lot of executive orders that have been done with President Trump, eliminating DEI in various different ways. So there's multiple ways in which to kind of attack these issues as they pop up. The Goldwater Institute, we specialize in state constitutions. So this is really an area where we thrive. Because there are deviations and actually more robust rights usually in the states and the state constitutions than there are in its federal counterparts. So that's why we stayed in state court here, but definitely other options and possibilities if something doesn't work out here.
So, Stacey, what is the next immediate step then for the process here?
So we're waiting on the Arizona Supreme Court to determine if they're going to accept the case, and then they'll hear that. So we have a briefing from the other side that's due in about a month here. So we'll see what they say and kind of go from there. Again, you can never predict when it's, the court has their own discretion of whether they're going to take a case, but we feel very confident that this is an issue of great importance for the state of Arizona. So we do think that they'll take this on.
And taking it on for us would mean then we get to argue the case of why I should be able to argue my case. So we're still one step removed. We're just asking the Supreme Court to consider if I can argue my case. and then they could say yes, and then we can argue my case back to the first court.
Yeah. And again, that is then arguing for all future faculty and staff, not just
that's the ironic part where the professor,
university, to be able to do that.
Self-identified, Marxist professor might be thinking, I don't want Anderson to get a win here, but I'm looking forward to when I can sue the MAGA administration. I don't want to lose that right either.
Right. It's a little bit of a double bind there for some of those colleagues. Well, Owen, it's, and Stacey, it's good to have you guys on there. We do want to get the word out about this and make people aware of it. It's a big issue, Owen. We know you've been fighting this battle for several years now. And it's not just that you're faculty at ASU. I mean, your history with ASU goes way back, right? I mean, you've done all your degrees there. I think you're a double alumnus from ASU. Yeah,
so in the professor world, Darren will tell you the same thing. You're not supposed to do that. And it's somewhat embarrassing to be at conferences because people will say, where'd you ASU, where'd you do your PhD? ASU. Oh, okay. So where was your undergrad? Also ASU. So I did 2 undergrad degrees at ASU, 2 master's degrees at ASU, and then my PhD, and then a tenure track job opened up. I applied, and I mean, they've got to be asking themselves the same question I ask: how do we hire this Anderson guy? What happened? What went wrong in our hiring process that he squeaked in? But here I am. So what I've done over the years is I've just owned it. I've made it worse because it is worse. That's not the whole story. My dad went to ASU, and I played in the sand under the bridge that is now a lake when it was still just sand back then when I was 4 years old, and I was in daycare at ASU. So I always say, it's a lot worse. I not only do my undergrad, I did my daycare at ASU.
Preschool.
But part of it's also a philosopher joke because, I'm a type of a Socrates in this case. And I'm not going after Athens because I hate Athens. I'm going after Athens because I love Athens.
Right.
I want Athens to be better. And I know it's making a mistake here. And my hope would be that Athens and ASU says, you're right. And on this side of the hemlock, right? Not because it says it later after Socrates is gone, but let's say it on this side this time. Let's learn from that mistake.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's important. I mean, it's people to realize that, you've got a long personal history here with this school. And you've seen it over the years deviate from what would be obviously a more appropriate mission for an academic institution. And it's out of love and concern for the institution.
And in doing so, hopefully you can save Arizona law from degenerating to sophistry, because some of the arguments that Stacey was relaying, they sounded like sophistry. That's what I was thinking in terms of we have to be able to distinguish law and legal precedent from just kind of made up stuff.
From rhetoric. Substance from rhetoric for sure.
That's right.
But one little thing is nullification, whether it's jury nullification. This is a kind of legal nullification, because if might be why a big firm like Perkins Coie is also interested. If they are successful, they don't need to overturn this law. It's done.
Right.
It can't be enforced. Yeah. And so going forward, state institutions can teach race blame, and there'll be no fear.
Well, and that's maybe the thing too. And as Lenny was saying, like this is about setting a precedent as well. One side wants to set one kind of precedent, and maybe overturning the precedent that that you can sue the institution like this over these things, and that would have ramifications, right? That would have ramifications across the country. And we know why they want to do that. I mean, I think we have a reasonable guess as to why that needs to be done, because you don't want to lose the ideological capture that exists at so many of our schools.
Yeah, this would serve to perfectly insulate them from public accountability.
Yeah, right, right. So definitely we'll keep abreast of this. We are praying for you in this battle, in this fight, and wishing you the best of luck. So. Good to see you again, Owen and Stacey. Yes, definitely. Thank you for joining us. This has been the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. If you've liked this episode, please click the like button below and hit subscribe. And thank you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.